Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today I'm planning to go through my favorite books of each of my 4 favorite genres. If you've been following my channel for a while now, you know that my reading taste has changed a lot over the years. I used to really love YA fantasy and a lot of other YA genres, but recently my reading taste has definitely shifted more into the adult space. And so with this video I thought I would update you on my favorites from each of my favorite genres, which include literary fiction, historical fiction, horror, and fantasy. When I think of my favorite books, these are the 4 genres that they end up going into. I do have other favorite genres like sci-fi, which I do really love, but I can't really think of more recent favorites, so that's why they're not on this video. Now with that said, if you enjoy my content and you like watching my videos, please go hit the like button and subscribe down below. And if you want to get some extra and exclusive content from me, then definitely go check out my bindery community down below. It is a wonderful little space where I share journal updates, monthly TBRs, exclusive videos, and where I also do monthly Zoom hangouts with my members. And if you like the books on this list and you like my taste in books, then I would highly recommend checking out my book club, the Boundless Book Club on Fable. We choose a different book each month that's usually by a BIPOC, underrepresented, marginalized author, and we discuss it on the app Fable, which has these really cool like chat rooms for each chapter of the book, so you can discuss the book without getting spoiled. Alrighty, with that said, let's get into my favorite literary fiction books. So I have about 5 or 6 of these, and the first one is Disorientation by Elaine Seicho. I love talking about this book. It's kind of similar to Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, if you've read that book. It also deals with the topic of yellowface, of race, of Orientalism, but it takes it in the context of this academia setting with a main character who has sort of lived in her own little bubble for a lot of her life and is starting to go through a process of decolonizing her mind. The book takes a little bit of a thriller bent to it like Yellowface and has a bit of a whodunit mystery to it, which will definitely keep you on the hook through the end of the book. And then one of my favorite things about this is that it is a bit of a satire, so it's really funny in that satirical way where you are sort of poking fun at the characters and their actions and all the things that are going on. This is one of those batshit crazy books that will like leave you being like, what the hell just happened? But it's definitely enjoyable and worth the read. Alrighty, the next book is one that I actually read very recently and absolutely fell in love with. It may be a favorite for 2024, and that is Evil Eye by Ataf Rum. This is by a Palestinian American author and features a Palestinian American main character. Her name's Yara. She is this married woman with a few kids, and she is sort of in this moment in her life where she's examining everything that has happened in her life and the way that she's led her life, and she's starting to wonder if she's actually even happy. This is a literary fiction, contemporary fiction that I feel like completely represents what it feels like to have depression, to go through a depression that so thoroughly consumes you and takes the form of you minimizing yourself in your relationships, in your life, and allowing other people to dictate your life. I absolutely love the character growth that our main character goes through, the way that she takes control of her life by the end, but I also just love the discussions of generational trauma in this book. Yara is from a line of Palestinian people. Her grandmother went through the Nakba and her mother went through displacement and abuse. This is a book that examines the very complicated feeling of coming from a line of generational trauma and the feeling of guilt that comes with that when you know you have it better than the people who came before you, but you're still unhappy. This is one that hit me in the feels and had me sobbing by the end, so yeah, I just highly recommend this one because I love it so much. Next up, I have a really weird one. It's similar to Disorientation in the sense that it's kind of batshit crazy in the way that it goes, but that book is Blue-Skinned Gods by S.J. Sindhu. This book has so many layers to it. It follows our main character Kalki, who was born with blue skin, and he's born in Tamil Nadu, India, and his family tells him that he is a god born on earth. And so they set up this ashram in India, and people come to visit him to get his blessings and to be cured. So Kalki grows up with this notion that he is a god because of his blue skin. This is like a thing from Hindu mythology. Many gods are depicted with blue skin. But as Kalki grows up and as he goes through different experiences, he starts to realize that there might be something more to this whole situation and more to his life. This is a book that will take you in so many different directions and leave you with some whiplash, but it's also a book that examines so many philosophical, historical, and emotional themes. This is both a coming of age story and a journey through faith and doubt. It's a story of spirituality, globalism, family trauma, and also gender and sexuality. There's a lot of queer themes to this book that I absolutely love, and there's some queer exploration, and it also ties back to some of the fluidity of sexuality in Hinduism. Anyways, if you're looking for a really multifaceted book by a South Asian author with a lot of themes from the culture, this is a great one to pick up. Next up, I have a book by an author that I actually typically do not like, but this is her one book that I absolutely love, and that is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. When I initially read this, I didn't know if I loved it or hated it, but every time I think of it since then, it just has me captivated, and I always think about certain lines from the book and just the general themes that were coming across in the book. This basically follows our main character Frances, who's studying in Dublin, and she is pursuing a career in writing, and she has a best friend named Bobby who she previously had a thing with, and who is this like very friendly and sort of self-obsessed person. But when Frances and Bobby come across this like well-known photographer at this event one night, they end up forming a friendship with that photographer and her husband, Nick. From there, Frances and Nick end up in an affair, and I think what I love about this book is not really like the romance or anything like that. It's really just like the hot sad girl vibes from Frances. She's also someone who's just going through a lot of like mental health issues, and I really loved both like the dark humor but also some of the beautiful lines and some of the like queer themes to the book. To me, this was like the stereotypical lit fic book, but it was just finally something more interesting, and I personally just loved the discussions of female friendship and just the way all of that came across on the page. If you like books with bittersweet endings and sort of open-ended questions, this is definitely one to pick up. Speaking of bittersweet endings and open-ended questions, Cleopatra and Frankenstein is my next recommendation. This is by Coco Malors. This was one of my favorite books of 2023, and for good reason. It is one of the most stunning literary contemporary fictions I've ever read. Although this book is named after two of the main characters, Cleo and Frank, it is actually about the whole cast of characters in their sort of a little circle of friends in New York City. We start with Cleo and Frank, who meet on New Year's Eve and sort of strike up this unlikely romance, but because Cleo is from the UK and her visa is expiring, they decide to impromptu get married, and the book sort of follows the aftermath of that and how it affects all of the other characters in their lives. And while this initially may seem like a romance, it really is not. It's just about sort of very messy people with their messy lives in New York City. It's about the idea of loneliness even when you are surrounded by so many other people, and it's also one of the most stunning portrayals of mental illness and mental health and addiction that I've ever seen. Every moment of this book just felt so real and just packed such a punch, and while I hated many of the characters, I really just loved following their messy lives. So if you're looking for a book that is both dark and funny and one that will make you feel all of the things, this is definitely one to pick up. Speaking of something that's dark and funny, my last book rec for literary fiction is Big Swiss by Jen Began. This was my favorite book of 2023 for many reasons. This one is more of a satire and definitely veers more on the funny side and has some really outrageous parts to it, but it also features a sapphic relationship and also a main character who is in like her middle age and who is essentially just going through another coming of age, trying to figure out her life again and just essentially going through it in the process. Essentially, this book starts with our main character Greta, who has flipped her entire life upside down. She's now living with a friend in New York, and she's working as a transcriber for this sex therapist. Now, while Greta is transcribing the sessions between the sex therapist and his patients, she starts to find herself romantically obsessed with this one woman who she starts calling Big Swiss. Big Swiss is this younger woman who is in a married relationship, and she has never had an orgasm before, and she's also gone through some traumatic abuse. But when Greta ends up meeting Big Swiss outside of the, transcriptions and the recordings of these sessions, she starts to use her knowledge about the sessions to sort of get into Big Swiss's life. From there, the book follows this sapphic relationship and affair, but also goes through the tumultuous sort of mental state of Greta. And I think what I loved about this was that it was such an accurate portrayal of mental illness and mental health, while also delivering all of that in this both cynical and funny way. If you love messy characters with their messy lives, this is yet again another one to pick up. Alrighty, now we're getting into my 4 favorite historical fictions. So the first 2 are from the same series, and that is Next Year in Havana and When We Left Cuba, both by Chanel Cleeton. These are companion novels in the same series, and they follow characters from the same family. And I've talked about these books multiple times, but Next Year in Havana follows 2 different main characters, Marisol and then Elisa. We follow Marisol, who is a writer in 2017. She lives in Miami, and she's traveling to Cuba to sort of reconnect with her heritage and understand the stories that her grandmother Elisa used to tell about her homeland. And then in the other timeline, we have the grandmother Elisa, but when she was a young girl in 1958 in Havana. And we are following her as she's this like daughter of this sugar baron, in the upper class in Cuba, but she falls in love with a revolutionary during the political unrest in Cuba during that time. What I love about this book is that it connects both the past and present political situation in Cuba and really talks about how that history has affected Cuba today, while also telling these really beautiful love stories in both timelines. This is one of those books that will just like grab onto your heart and sort of break it. And I love the part mystery that we're getting, trying to figure out what happened to Elisa and to her lover, but also all of the themes that this book covers. Now, When We Left Cuba essentially follows Elisa's sister Beatrice, and this follows her in the 1960s in Florida after her family has fled to the United States. And Beatrice has held this sort of quest for revenge because of everything that's happened to her family, and she finds her life taking some really unexpected directions, and she ends up falling in love with this very powerful man in the States. What I loved about this book was the main character Beatrice. She was just such a spunky and fun and hard-headed, but also super independent woman who was just doing her own thing. She was just so inspiring, but also super vulnerable and very relatable as a character who just was fighting for her family. This one again delves into that forbidden love affair type of vibe, but also gives us a lot of historical and political themes. Alrighty, speaking of history and politics and forbidden romances, the next book that I have is The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali. I've talked about this book so many times, but it is honestly just one of my favorite books. I've read it twice now, and it did not disappoint even on the second time around. Essentially, this book follows a pair of teens who fall in love in 1953 Tehran, Iran. They exchange these letters through this stationery shop in Iran, but the story actually focuses more on the subsequent events where they are pulled apart for reasons larger than themselves, and also because of the political unrest in Iran during that time. And part of the timeline actually visits them in our current day when the two main characters are meeting again after a very long time and trying to understand what happened in between. This book not only delves into the forbidden romance and the politics, but it also delves into motherhood and mental illness and just generational trauma and also the immigrant experience. It's one of those books that's just so heartbreaking and will definitely leave you sobbing by the end. And the way it's written is just so beautiful, evocative, and stunning, and you just can't walk away from it without highlighting a bunch of lines. Alrighty, my last historical fiction favorite is definitely not for the faint of heart, and one that you should definitely search up the content warnings for, but that book is Pachinko by Min-jin Lee. This is a sort of beautiful and breathtaking saga of this one family over a century, and it starts with our teenage Korean main character Sunja in the 1900s, and we start with her in Korea and we follow her as she's taken into Japan and during the colonial period in Korea, and then later we follow some of her descendants in the United States as well. Essentially, this book starts with Sunja and kind of her parents, and then we are also following her children and the people who are in her family and surround her, and we are told a heartbreaking story that involves like generational trauma, war, colonialism, crime, survival, forbidden love, and so much more. This is one of those books that I feel like you just need to go into without knowing too much, but you will learn to just fall in love with some of these characters, but also you'll learn to hate some of these characters. But I think their messy lives and their ardent desire to survive amongst these horrible moments in history is just such an endearing and heartbreaking story that you do not want to miss. If you love books that leave you with a lot of questions and don't give you a lot of answers, then this is definitely one to pick up. Alrighty, the next genre that I'm going to talk about is my favorite horror books. So first up I have the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This is one of the first like significant horror books that I ever read that really told me that I might actually like this genre, and it's definitely a genre that I've started picking up a lot more recently. But essentially this book is just this really fun horror novel that's set in the 90s. It follows this suburban mom who's in this like book club with these other women in town, and essentially her town is visited by this mysterious stranger, and our main character Patricia has a sneaking suspicion that there's more to the stranger who is in town. And when she starts learning about children going missing around town, and especially in some of the poorer neighborhoods in town, she starts to hatch a plan with her other book club members to try and stop him. This book is essentially the idea of Dracula versus your mom. Like, what would happen if Dracula was up against the moms who want to protect their children, who would do anything for their children. It's both a horror novel, but also a story of motherhood, of female friendships, and also taps into some socio-political injustices and really delivers some impeccable thrills and chills. I remember reading some scenes in this book and being absolutely spooked, so this is definitely a one for the horror fans. The next few horror books are more on the romantic side of horror, and the first one is A Diary of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I read this in the last couple of months and absolutely fell in love with it. I know it's a big book talk favorite as well. Essentially, this book follows our main character Constanta, who is one of Dracula's brides, and we're basically following her life with Dracula across centuries as she is introduced to other brides that he decides to collect. And the book is actually told in the second person as if with Constanta is writing this really long letter to Dracula without sort of naming him and just calling him you. And essentially what unfolds from there is this depiction of this toxic and abusive relationship, but also this very beautiful polyamorous relationship on the other side of it. This is a sexy, spine-tingling, dark romance horror novel that will just have you falling in love with the characters and also just being so romanced by the period details and the history of it all. I really loved a lot of lines in this book and just loved the way that it was told, so I feel like the storytelling was a major aspect for why I enjoyed it. Alrighty, the next horror book that I have is Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. This is one of my favorite books of 2023, and for good reason. This is a contemporary horror and really delves into the idea of beauty and this sort of strive for perfection. The book has a really endearing main character who starts out as a piano prodigy. She's the daughter of Chinese immigrants who fled China following the Cultural Revolution, and essentially she finds herself in this difficult position where she's trying to take care of her parents, but she's also sort of washed up in her piano career, and she's sort of working like these odd-end jobs, and she ends up being invited to be one of the sort of customer service representatives at this beauty company called Holistic. And at this company they have like these different beauty products, and the management there has the girls who work there take home all these products and use them to enhance their own beauty so that they look beautiful at the store. And from there it's like this really interesting story and horrific story and very chilling story about this strive for perfection and of beauty and all the lengths that we will go for beauty. This book also has some queer undertones to it, which I really loved, and overall it's just like one of these really weird and batshit crazy books that just examine some really interesting themes, and I just really loved it. But it's definitely not one that's very straightforward and one that will be a bit confusing and strange, but I think you just need to roll with it. Alrighty, the last horror is one of my absolute favorites and one that's been a favorite for a few years now, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of my favorite authors, and this is by far my favorite of her books. This is a bit of a gothic horror, I would say. Essentially it's set in 1950s Mexico, and it follows our main character Noemi, whose cousin has recently married this like English lord who's living in the Mexican countryside, and he owns this like big manor home. And so when Noemi starts receiving these strange letters from her cousin who is talking about how her husband is doing all these strange things and there are people walking through walls and the place is haunted, she decides to go there and investigate and see what's up. From there we get a very gothic tale as Noemi is confronted with the very mysterious husband of her cousin and all these strange inhabitants and all these strange goings on in the manor house. If you love old houses, family secrets, and a bit of history, then you're really gonna love this one because it just delivers this really creepy, haunting, and twisty tale that involves love and betrayal. This is one of the most atmospheric books I've ever read, and it's definitely a fun horror to pick up. Alrighty, now we're on to some of my favorite fantasies, and the first one is also another Silvia Moreno Garcia book, and that is The Beautiful Ones. This is a little bit more of a romance, I would say, but it is set in this sort of fantasy version of a Regency era England. So it's very much like a Jane Austen novel. It involves like high society and, you know, trying to find husbands and going to balls and that kind of thing. But it also involves this world that has like these people who have magical abilities, including our main character. But the main crux of the plot is sort of the romance and the love triangle and revenge plot going on. I feel like this is one of those books that you should just go into without knowing too much, but you will definitely love the like character growth and the romance that develops throughout this book and how you get this magical tale of love and betrayal in this world where scandal is like the worst weapon. Alrighty, my next favorite fantasy is yet another Silvia Moreno Garcia book, and that is The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. This is one of her more recent releases, and it's set in 19th century Mexico, and it's actually based off a classic story called The Island of Dr. Moreau. And essentially we're following the daughter of Dr. Moreau on this island who has essentially been tasked with creating these like hybrids to use as laborers. And so our main character Carlota is surrounded by these different hybrids that her father has created. We also have another character named Montgomery. He's an Englishman, and he is sort of one of the people employed by Dr. Moreau. And so there's a bit of a like forbidden slash angsty romance going on in this book, which I absolutely love and which is probably my favorite part of this book. But there's also a lot of themes in this book of like colonialism and eugenics, and I think it just made for a really interesting read, but also a very sort of heartwarming one, I think. This is a book filled with characters that are so very endearing, but also characters who just make some really dumb decisions. And I don't know, I just feel like it made for a really sweet and just compelling read. I just really cared for all these characters despite all the things that they were doing, and I was just rooting for them all by the end. Speaking of endearing characters, one of my most recent fantasy books is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I love this book so much, and I'm really excited to read the sequel, which is out this month as well. This is essentially a really cozy fantasy. It's set in like 19th century England, and it follows our curmudgeonly professor Emily Wilde. In this version of our world, there are fairies and people know about them, and our main character is like the foremost expert on them. And so she's writing this Encyclopedia of Fairies, and she happens to go to this like small town to investigate and learn about this specific race of fairies called the Hidden Fae. And so we're following her in this like small town as she's trying to get to know the residents there and get answers from them, but she's very much not like the social person. She's very much like the grumpy, you know, professor. And while I really loved all the fantasy elements to this book, I actually really also loved the romance in it. It's got a really beautiful and heartwarming romance with Emily's colleague Bamblebee. He's definitely more of the sunshine guy, and there's a mystery revolving around him as well. And overall, I think it was just such a fun and cozy sort of lower stakes fantasy that is just a wonderful time. Like, it's so magical and lovely and something to just curl up with and make you feel good. Alrighty, we're on to the last two books here and my last two favorite fantasies. These are two books that I've talked about so much, so maybe I'll keep this short, we'll see. But the first one is Kaigeri by Vaishnavi Patel. As you guys know, this is like one of my all-time favorite books ever. This is essentially a feminist retelling of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and essentially we take the perspective of sort of the evil stepmother character in the epic. She's a very minor character in the epic, but this book takes her perspective, tells her story from when she's a child into her adulthood, into the events of the epic. This book gives a voice to this character who didn't really have a voice and brings a more three-dimensional look into her character. I think for people who know the epic and the different characters in it, this is a huge treat because you'll see all those characters come in, and it's just really interesting to see like the subversion of their characters in this book. But even for those of you who don't know the epic and aren't familiar with it, this is just a really beautiful fantasy story that follows a really amazing and also messy main character who's very independent, who's just really kick butt and also really intelligent. And I think overall what I love about this book the most is that it is a story about women helping other women and also the dangers of unchecked patriarchy. I think the way that Vaishnavi Patel goes through all those themes and displays them is just so incredible, and I just loved this book so much. Alrighty, and then the last book that I have to recommend is Babel by R.F. Kuang, one of my favorite fantasy books. This is a very popular book and a lot of people know about it, but I love this book because it is a historical fantasy, dark academia that really delves into the topic of colonialism. It talks about the necessity of violence when it comes to revolution, and it follows a really beautiful cast of diverse main characters who are studying at Oxford's fictional translation institute called Babel. We follow our main characters through their several years of study at Babel, and we follow them through some really dramatic and dark academia-esque events. I think one of the things that I really loved about this book also was just the discussion of linguistics and language, and also the power of translation and how translation is often used as a tool of colonialism. This book connects so many themes that you think are so different, but actually connect all together and really drive this machine of colonialism. And I just loved how she imbued like the magical element of it into this story to really drive the point home. So if you're looking for a fantasy that does not operate in a vacuum and really addresses, you know, our own history and the topics of today, then this is definitely one to pick up. Alrighty, and with that said, those are all of my favorite books from my 4 favorite genres. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you got some new recommendations from me. I feel like this is a really accurate portrayal of some of my favorite books currently at this very moment. And if you're new to my channel, I hope you got a sense of the books that I love, but also the types of books that you can expect to see on this channel. Anyways, let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, if you liked them, if you didn't, and also let me know if you have any recommendations for me based off the books that I recommended for each of these genres. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!